I hope it also gets you thinking about when you were a teen. Who you hung out with? What did you do for fun? And most importantly, what did you read? When was it that you encountered your first unreliable narrator? Perhaps it was Holden Caulfield, or maybe Humbert Humbert, or maybe you were a fan of Edgar Allan Poe's Twisty Tales. Discovering the unreliable narrator can be a life-changing experience. Suddenly, the world isn't black and white. It hovers on gray. How did you first feel when you realized that the narrator wasn't quite so credible? There are many reasons why the narrator is unreliable. It could have been because the narrator was suffering from some sort of trauma or mental illness. It could have been because the narrator was so very young and naive and didn't quite have the worldly view of the reader. Or it could have been because the narrator just loves to lie. I've discovered that books with unreliable narrators often make for the best book discussions. A few years ago, I introduced a group of teens to Liar by Justine Morbelestier. After a passionate and dynamic discussion, the teens took away a few things about unreliable narrators. A few people lie to protect themselves. And the reader will look at the book and narrator differently after a second or even a third reading. The unreliable narrator can take away your trust of a character that you've probably connected with most in a story. How can you ever believe in a narrator again? So that leads me to my first question for the panel. When writing a book with an unreliable narrator, do you concern yourself with their likability for reader appeal? And anyone can go first.
I've never once in my life worried about likability of the main character, which is obvious if you read my books. Okay, help with that. I sort of tend to think that if you worry too much about, is this character likable, is this character likable, you start to shear off what the rough edges that make the character most interesting. And that's just me. I mean, maybe I'm just not skilled enough to make the character likable and still have those rough edges. I just find it easier and more honest to treat the character as if they were a real person. And we all know people that aren't 100% likable, but they're just fascinating and they're interesting. And we don't want to like them or be drawn to them, but somehow we are. And so I never think about that, whether it's sort of an unreliable narrator or a completely reliable narrator, which I don't think there is such a thing. But I just don't worry about that.
I think the question is whether you are involved with the character. One of my favorite books with an unreliable narrator is Gentlemen Prefer Blondes by Anita Luce. And Lorelei Lee, who's the character that Marilyn Monroe plays in the movie, narrates that novel, and she is a, diamonds are a girl's best friend, money hunting blonde. And, everything that Lorelei does is completely despicable, and yet you just feel compelled by her. She invites you in. She is charming. You would never want to spend your life with her, but you would very much want to spend dinner, the cocktail hour with her, and perhaps the entire night. So, I mean, that was one of the first, maybe that's the answer, what is the first unreliable narrator you were really captivated by? And that book was it for me. And I often think back to that, like, why did I want to read that book? Why did I want to follow Lorelai's adventures? And a lot of it just had to do with the voice, or just did I want to spend time with this person? I didn't have to like her to want to spend time with her, and that's true in real life with a lot of people as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons to like people in general, and reasons to like characters, and a lot of reasons to dislike them. And obviously personality comes into it. Not everybody is going to read Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and love Lorelei Lee, but I also had that experience of thinking that she was incredibly cool. I read it as an adult, and I think there can be something about characters who tend to lie, and just sociopathic personalities in general, where they can be very charismatic. And that charisma can carry you through all sorts of horrible things that they're doing. And in fact, it can kind of make it more fun to read. I think it's cool to be friends with, or feel like you could be friends with the character that you're reading, but I don't think that you have to. I don't think as a teen I felt like I had to, and I don't think as an adult certainly not, because there's more to a story than just feeling like you could be best friends with the character. There's their whole world, and there's the way that they interact with that world, and there's a way that you can get into the head of a narrator that you can't get into the head of any person you actually know. And so the relationship you have with them is different. And I think that is maybe one of the reasons why you wouldn't want to hang out with like the sociopathic main character of, you wouldn't want to hang out with Dexter, but Dexter is like a fun character to read or watch on TV because you're more in his world and in his head than you could ever be as a person interacting with him. And I think that's kind of the magic of Unreliable Narrators.
Which is what Barry is doing, right? I mean, you don't want to be
Right
there.
now?
No, I mean, in your, do we call it the I Hunt Killer series? What do we call it?
Sure.
Okay.
I think that's what it's called. I don't know. I just write them.
Is that Dexter type of, a person with terrifying human impulses?
I'll have to take your word for it because I've never seen Dexter. But yeah, I mean, not to go too much, but it's like, I think there's a distinction between unlikable characters who are interesting and unlikable characters who are just unlikable. There are plenty of times where I've read a review of a book, some of which I have written, that have said, I just hated this character and I couldn't get into the book. And then other times where people are like, God, this character is such a dick, but it was just amazing and just, I couldn't get enough. And, that's a tough line to watch.
Yeah, and it's not going to work for everybody.
Right, exactly. That's why they make more than one book.
Speaking up for the likable, unreliable narrators who aren't so devious, I think with I've done a couple of narrators who I would call sort of unreliable, and I think what they sort of bring to the table for me is it's not important whether they're likable or not, but whether they're invested in the story in some way, what their connection to the story is, what they're sort of getting out of their connection to the main characters, their connection to the plot, and that sort of engages me with them, whether they're likable or not.
Thinking of the interesting connection between how we choose a character to read and how we choose a president. Do you remember during Bush v. Gore, that question, who would you rather have a beer with? Well, we all know how that turned out. The idea that you have to want to, really just sort of sit down and be pals with who runs our country is alarming to me. And that's sort of true for characters. I mean, somebody said about novels that the thing that you remember about the novels you love is not plot, but character. And it's not that the character is like someone you relate to. I always sort of get a little stiff at that idea, I didn't relate to that character. If you have to relate to a character, you can't read Lolita. There are a lot of things that are just outside of your wheelhouse. The only book I would be able to read would be the Book of Meg. The notion really that reading enhances who we are is something that I hold dear. So the idea of reading about people who are different, who you can never even imagine their lives. That's what reading, that study that was done about how people who read fiction have a greater capacity for empathy. We all knew that, right? Finally, we have the science to back it up. But it's empathy for people who are not just somebody who would be your best friend, but maybe in another lifetime could have been, or someone you might never like, but at least understand why they did the things they did.
Thank you.